Cornerstone Christian Academy is a distinctive kind of place. I am convinced that it is different from other schools. Year after year, week after week, children come in and God changes their lives. Back in the mid-90s, there had been a group of people praying that a Christian school would start in the Bloomington-Normal area. At the time, they thought it was going to be a Christian high school, but that group never seemed to really take off or go anywhere. I became involved at the time. We knew it was going to start from the ground up. And so a task force formed, and we began to pray and to meet to see what God would have us do to begin this Christian school. And two things came out of those early days of this task force. One was that the task force decided, based on our prayer, that God was calling this school to be independent, that it would not be affiliated with any church, but would rather welcome students from all churches and even those who were unchurched. And so that was number one. Number two, at the same time that the task force decided that it was going to be independent, Eastview Christian Church, who was very much involved in the beginning stages, decided that they were going to disband their current preschool. So these two things came together at the same time. They turned the preschool over to us, and that's really how it began. They gave us everything. So we started at the old Eastview building on Towanda, and we had 1 year to be there and to find a new building.
So that was where I thought I had some expertise, because I had been, prior to coming to this new school, I had been a deputy tax assessor in Normal, so I knew who owned buildings, who rented buildings, who leased buildings. So I thought finding a school building would not be difficult at all. And so we looked, and we were looking, and there wasn't, I was all over town talking to people. We talked to contractors. We did so much talking, and nothing was happening. Now understand, we were praying every day that God would show us and take us to a school, to a building that we could house our school. But nothing happened until one day in October. We had been looking now for over 6 months for a building. And I remember saying to Becky, we're gonna have to get really serious with God about this building. And so we decided, after the morning preschoolers had left for the day, that we would go into her office and we would pray. And we would pray like we had not prayed. And so we did that. We made lists of everybody we had talked to about the school, all the pastors and churches we had visited, all the business people in the area we had talked to. We even prayed, made a list of all the elders at Eastview, and we prayed a prayer of repentance, that if there was anything we had done, or anything that had been done before us, before our time, that was keeping God from answering this prayer for our building, we repented of it. And we had a wonderful time of prayer that day, prayed for several hours on our knees. And then an amazing thing happened, because that was on a Thursday. The following Sunday, a man at East White Oak Bible Church went up to the pastor, Jeff Van Gotham, who was the president of our school board at the time, and said, has that Cornerstone ever thought to check out the Grace United Methodist Church in Bloomington, because they may have some space there? So Jeff called me and said, April, check out that building. And I said, we don't want to be in another church. We're an independent school. We want to be independent. He says, go check it out. And I, who thought I had all the expertise and knew where all the buildings were, had never heard of this church and didn't know where it was. In fact, we've often said, you have to be lost to find it. But we looked it up, and we started driving, and it was on Clinton, 622 South Clinton in Bloomington. And I thought, well, Clinton dead ends into Oakland Avenue. But actually what it does is it takes a little jog, and pretty soon you're in a very quiet neighborhood, and here was this almost 100-year-old church standing on the corner. And I remember we pulled up to it, and attached to this church was a 3-story school building. And I remember saying to Becky, "It's a school." And we just looked at each other and we said, "It's a school." And we left the car almost right in the middle of the road and went to try the doors to see if we could get in. And all the doors were locked except one. And we got in and we started going through this school building. And it looked like it was not being used very much. A couple of rooms seemed to have furniture in them, but the rest had supplies from the 60s, old Sunday school supplies from the 60s. And pretty soon the pastor of the church heard us, and he came to find us, and he says, "Can I help you?" And we sat down with him and explained who we were, that we were Cornerstone, and we were looking for a building, and it looked like they had plenty of room there, and would they be willing to rent us some space? And he said, "Well, I don't see why not." And because it was such a small church, it was almost that easy. And right across the street from this old church was a beautiful city park. And so that was our green space for our playground and for our kids to go on during recess. And so God had totally answered our prayers.
So we finished our first year at the old Eastview building on Towanda Avenue. And it was a really exciting year. Understand that we just had preschoolers, just 45 preschoolers that year. But there were 2 significant things that happened at the end of the year that were going to make a difference later on in our history. In May, we had 2 little pre-kindergarten boys received Christ. And I can't tell you how exciting that was. It was such an affirmation to us because we'd been praying for these little children. And to have 2 of them come to Christ right at the end of our first year was such a blessing. It was as if God was patting us on the back saying, "You're on track, keep going." And throughout the years, it has seemed that God has never really let us be discouraged. So that was a very exciting time in the life of the school. The other thing that happened at the end of that year was preschool graduation. We actually did have a graduation ceremony for these little 4-year-olds who were going to go to kindergarten. And afterwards, we had a punch and cookie reception for the parents and their families. And while we were there, one of the siblings of our preschoolers came up to me. His name is Travis, and he literally walked over to me, grabbed my sleeve and tugged on my sleeve and said, "Mrs. Seamus, won't you please open a 4th grade next year so I could come?" So Travis had heard the plan, and our plan was to open up kindergarten through 3rd grade the following year. And we had that pretty well set into motion. But because of Travis's request, I looked at him and said, "You know, Travis, we are only going to go through 3rd grade next year, but I'll tell you what, we'll pray about it." And so pray we did. And sure enough, through a series of circumstances, it became evident that God would have us open up kindergarten through 4th grade, and Travis was in that first 4th grade class.
So as we got ready to move into the school building at Grace United Methodist Church, we certainly had preschool furniture because we had been a preschool already for a year, and Eastview had given us all of their furniture. But now we were going to open up kindergarten through 4th grade, and I didn't have a clue as to where we were going to go find desks and chairs. And to buy a brand new desk and chair for a kindergartner at the time was about $150 a piece, and we had no money. And so we began to pray, and as kids were coming and registering at Cornerstone, we would pray, "God, you're bringing us all these students who certainly are going to bring us chairs so they can sit down." And someone said, "April, you need to go check out school sales because lots of schools over the summer will sell things in their warehouse." So I started making calls all over the state to see who was going to have a school sale, and the only school district that I found having a school sale was Bloomington, the last place I called. And so on June 7th, 1998, we went to, 5 of us, Bob and Becky Seamus and my husband David, myself, and 1 board member went to the Bloomington school sale held at the Bloomington High School. walked into their cafeteria and they had stacks and stacks all the way to the ceiling of desks and chairs. And because we had researched and knew exactly what size furniture we needed, we started pulling chairs out of the stack and making a little pile of chairs that would be suitable for our kids. And in fact, a gentleman came over and he started looking at our pool of chairs right there, and we got a little nervous he was going to buy them out from under us. And so we very quickly bought them for $1 a piece. So we spent $45 on those chairs. And anyway, it was an auction, and so the auctioneer would go from 8-foot table to 8-foot table and be packed with stuff. And he would say, "Does anybody want to bid $1 on anything on these tables?" And there was hardly anyone at that school sale. I think there were like 10 people there, and 5 of them were us. And we would go from table to table. And I remember specifically one table, and underneath the table on the floor was a laminator, a very large one. And I'd never used a laminator, but I knew teachers loved laminators because they were always laminating everything for their classrooms. And so I was ready. And there was another woman there, and I could tell she wanted that laminator. And so when the auctioneer said, "Does anyone want to bid for $1 for anything on this table?" It was worth $2,700. And it worked perfectly, and I'm convinced that some school in Bloomington is missing their laminator because God decided to give it to us. But at any rate, we walked out of there that day with 120 desks, 90 chairs, the laminator, computer monitors and keyboards, and we'd already been given the CPUs from Unit 5, tables and chairs, teacher desks, computer software, an entire phone system, study carrels, which we still have in our library today. We walked out of there and our total bill was $62. And remember, we'd spent $45 already on those chairs, so you can see how good God was to provide everything we needed.
Well, we needed lots of things in order to be a school. One of the things we determined that we had to have was a sign. We wanted a sign to put out in front of Bell Street when we moved that told the world that Cornerstone Christian Academy was in that building. And so, as we were wont to do, we started praying that God would lead us to the right sign. So that was kind of April's job. So back in our offices at the old Eastview building, April was sitting at her desk and she pulls out the yellow pages, having a little chat with the Lord about how we need a sign. And there were all kinds of things to choose from, but she chose the right one at the time for our circumstances, because as she said, we never had any money. So she called Budget Sign, thinking we could get an inexpensive sign there. So she had a nice conversation with the man at Budget Sign, who basically helped her zero in on what kind of sign we wanted. So at the end of that conversation, we knew we wanted one of those nice wood cedar signs that you see in some of the city parks, 2x6. Carved with our name and good colors. But we really wanted to see it first. And so as she's sitting there at her desk looking at the yellow pages, she said to the Lord, "You know, Lord, it would be really nice if we could see a signed showroom." And just about that time, sure enough, her eyes fall on an ad at the bottom of the page that says, "Come see our signed showroom." And it was a company called Prairie Signs. And so she grabs me and off we go. And this young man came out of the office and he said, "Can I help you?" And we said, "Yes, you can. We are looking for a sign." And then came the dreaded question, "What's your budget?" We have no budget. We have no money. We are praying for a sign. And he looked a little bit startled, but then he said, "Well, I guess God does that sometimes." And I said, "Oh, he does it for us all the time." And he's starting to explain different kinds of signs. I notice that on his left wrist, he's wearing a WWJD bracelet on his wrist, which was very popular at the time. What would Jesus do? And I knew then and there that God had once again put us right in touch with the exact person that he wanted to give us a sign through. And so I spent the next minute and a half trying to get April's attention, poking her, saying, "Look at his wrist." So she knew that we were in the right place for our sign. And as we went through the showroom, he is pointing out all of those things, and then suddenly he stops and he says, "Do you need a one-sided sign or a two-sided sign?" And so we said, "Well, a one-sided sign would probably be fine." And he said, "You know, we have some spoiled signs out in the warehouse, and let's take a look, and if we can find one that will work for you, I'll give you a sign." And so sure enough, we go out into the warehouse, and up in a loft above the work area are these spoiled signs. They had been carved on one side and there was a mistake, and so they just whited it out. But the other side would be fine for carving. And he points one out to us, and we knew it was our sign. It was a cedar sign, and it was 2 by 6. God had taken us to our side.
We have a unique development policy at Cornerstone, which is that we don't ask for money. And we also don't do fundraisers, which is very different from most schools like ours, where fundraising is what they do all the time. We don't do that. Instead, we decided early on that we would rely on voluntary gift donations from donors. And getting the word out was difficult because we were a brand new school. We didn't really have a mailing list, but somehow someone got on our mailing list that we didn't know. And I remember in May of 1998 receiving a check in the mail for $100 from this couple. And I was just dumbfounded because I said to Becky, "Do you know them?" And she didn't know them, I didn't know them. I don't know how they got on our mailing list because we only had a mailing list of about 50 at the time. But $100, so we quickly receipted this gentleman. And lo and behold, there is another check from this couple, this time for $500. Now they really have our attention because at the time I think we only had about $600 in the checkbook. And so they've doubled what we had in our checkbook. And so I told Becky, we have to take this couple to lunch because that is what I learned to do in my development track.
So she comes to me and bosses me around and tells me that I have to call because she wasn't going to do it. So I did. I didn't know the man, but I agreed to call him. And we invited him out to lunch. And it was obvious that he was a little bit reluctant to go out and have lunch with 2 women he did not know until God put it into my head to invite his wife. And I said, "You know, we would love to have your wife come, so would you come with both of us?" And so at that point, he did agree. And I think that was on a Wednesday that we went out and had lunch with this couple. And it was a delightful time. We truly did just want to say thank you. And so we had the opportunity to tell them about the 2 little boys who had received Christ in May at the end of the preschool year. They were obviously very moved by that. We told them all of our answers to prayer that we had and what God was doing. Thanked them for their gift. So that was on a Wednesday. The very next day, back in the office, I had to order the first set of books. And it was getting into the summer. We had kids registered, which was amazing to us that anybody would register at this brand new school, but they did. And so we had to have books, but we had literally about $600 in the checkbook at the time. And so I was in my office chatting with the Lord, saying, "Lord, you're bringing us students, you've given us desks and chairs, the sign, you've given us all that we need to be a school. You know that we need books, that we have no money for books." And so I gulped, picked up the phone, and I ordered about $4,000 worth of books that day, not knowing where the money was going to come from, but believing that God would be faithful to provide them. So that was on Thursday. On Monday, on the following Monday, we had an envelope in the mail, no return address, but when we opened it up, it was a check from this couple that we had had lunch with the following Wednesday. And it wasn't 100 and it wasn't 500, it was $25,000. And we were dumbstruck. April had me call again, only this time I couldn't really talk. I just blubbered into the phone to thank them for that $25,000. But I think my favorite part of that story is what happened on Tuesday and how kind and how personal our God is. Because on Tuesday, I got a call from the book company. And because we were a startup, we had no credit history at all. They said, you are going to have to pay for those books up front before we will send them. And I was able to say, no problem. The money was in the bank, more than what we needed. And so we had ordered the books, and God had gone before us through the whole thing.
So we moved into our building in the summer of 1998, August, right before school was supposed to start. And we had all the desks and chairs we needed. And we were setting up our classrooms, and we started with 88 students. The majority of them were in preschool, but I think we had 35 in grades, kindergarten through 4th grade. We were praying for 100, but we started that August with 88 students. And one of the things that became very evident right from the beginning is that our school was going to have a culture of prayer, that we were going to teach our students to pray like we had learned to pray just in preparation to start this school, that we serve a powerful God who is able to answer more than we can ask or imagine. And I remember a certain 4th grade class who we needed another chalkboard. And when the chalkboard came to the front of the school, this great big semi pulled up in front of the school and unloaded the chalkboard, and the chalkboard was cracked. So we had to send it back. And school had started, and this 4th grade class had an itty-bitty chalkboard they were using. And so we waited for the replacement, and big truck pulled up, and I opened the box, and again, the chalkboard, the replacement was cracked. So one more time, we send it back, and then that 4th grade class started to pray that, God, when you could bring us a chalkboard that isn't broken. And I'll never forget on the day that that big truck pulled up, those 4th graders, their class was at the front of the building, and they were looking out the window praying, asking God to keep that chalkboard in one piece. And I opened up the box, and of course it was perfect. And that did more for their faith. So we've had this culture of prayer. The staff prays together at 7:30 every morning. The students are praying every day, different times of the day. And so there is a culture of prayer, and we wanted to be quick to tell the students every time God did something or answered a prayer for us. I'll never forget November 20th, 1998. It was a really special day. It was a Friday morning, and we had our regular chapel service in the small chapel at Grace United Methodist. And I was sitting that day with some kids behind me, some 4th graders behind me. And a pastor from East White Oak Bible Church had come that day, and he was doing an object lesson. He had brought a box that was all wrapped up. And his object lesson was how salvation is a gift from God. It is not something we deserve or anything we can possibly earn. And as he presented that, he gave an invitation for kids to receive Christ. And there was commotion going on behind me. And I turned around and I overheard one boy say to another, "Do you want to receive Jesus as your Savior?" And the other boy, who was by this time weeping, said, "Yes, I do." And wouldn't you know, that boy who received Christ that day was none other than Travis, the boy who had tugged on Becky's sleeve and had said, "Won't you please open a 4th grade?" And now we understood on that day why we had to open a 4th grade. It was for Travis, so that he could come to faith in Christ. So I decided a great idea would be to tell the Travis story in a postcard. So I quickly made up a postcard that had the whole story on it, and we sent it out to everyone on our mailing list. And as a result of that wonderful story about Travis, we received the next month, the day of our Christmas program, a check for $50,000 from a couple who said, "We loved the Travis story."
And actually on the check stub, it was a 2-part check, and the donor had written, "All glory to God." Well, now we were in the 2nd semester of our 1st year at Bell Street, and we were making preparations for the next year. We were going to need to expand the computer lab, going from 11 to 22. And so we started praying that God would give us the computers. And he did, through April's son Doug and his connections. We had the computers, but now we needed the monitors to go with them. And we needed 11. And so we started praying that God would give us these 11 monitors to close out this new computer lab. Well, shortly after we started praying, we got a check from some grandparents who had heard about our need for the monitors, and we got a check for 2 of the monitors. So 2 down, 9 to go. We kept praying and praying. On the Friday before spring break, April and I were out in the back parking lot unloading the children, as we did every day. And right when we were ready to go into the building after unloading, a preschool dad pulled into the parking lot with a truck and said, "Do you still need computer monitors?" And we said, "Well, yes, of course we do." And so he said, "Well, you know, I've got some in the back of my truck. You can have them if you need them." And the story behind these monitors is that he was a policeman for the town of Normal, and they had found these monitors literally on the curb in front of a house in Normal, and they thought that they were stolen, and so they had confiscated them, taken them to the police station. But when they talked to the man who put them out on the curb, they found out that they were not stolen, that he simply did not want them, and so he'd put them out on the curb for anybody who wanted to pick them up. Sure enough, he brings them up, we take them upstairs. They were dirty because they'd been sitting outside. We cleaned them up, plugged them in, and every single one of those monitors worked. And guess how many there were? There were 9. There were 9, just exactly what we needed. So that was about 8:30 in the morning when he came. A couple of hours later, one of the dads showed up, and he's carrying up to the 3rd floor, which is where our offices were, another monitor. And he said, "Do you still need monitors?" And we said, "Well, you know, we did need monitors until about 8:30 this morning, but God just supplied the last 9 that we needed." And he said, "Well, why don't you take it just in case, because you never know when you'll need another monitor." So that was about 10:30, and at 11:30, a class was in the computer lab, and one of the monitors died. And God had already gone before us. We had the replacement that we needed. And so we had the expanded lab that we were going to need for the following year. Throughout that first year, as April said, we started with 88 students, and we had prayed and prayed that God would allow us to end with 100. And in May, which is a crazy time for any student to start, in May we got our 100th student and finished the year with 100 students exactly.
This brings me to what I think is probably my favorite story. As it turned out, we were in this 3-story school building attached to the Grace United Methodist Church, and it did not have bathrooms on the 3rd floor, which is where our offices were. But all the plumbing was there. It had been roughed in. It just had never been completed. And one of the things that Becky and I would often pray is that we would be a blessing to this church. And so we decided that we would spend the money and put in bathrooms. And we began to pray. If God would provide for our bathrooms, we wanted to bless the church with these bathrooms upstairs. And so at the same time we were putting in bathrooms, we were also finishing about 4,000 square feet of really awful space in this school building that had gotten into disrepair because of a bad roof and leaks and water damage. And we were building that out as well. We had an army of volunteers doing that for us. But as we prayed for these bathrooms, God started to work. And we had parents come into the school bringing us their mirrors from their own bathrooms. I remember I called a bathroom place and asked for 6-foot vanities, and maybe seconds, or something that was out of style. And I needed 2 6-foot vanities with double sinks. And I remember the woman on the other end of the phone said, "Well, we don't have any scratch and dent, but you know what?" She says, "I will pay for half of these." And this woman, complete stranger, paid for half of our vanities. We were praying for ceiling tile. And in fact, my husband, who was doing some of the work there, said, "Why don't you write a letter to State Farm, because you will have to they have lots of ceilings there, and maybe they will give you ceiling tile." And I really didn't want to take the time to write the letter, but I did. And as it turned out, State Farm called and said, "We never give ceiling tile away, but if you come right now, you can have all you need." And so we had ceiling tile, not just for the bathroom, but for all these classrooms we were building out. I remember we had to order some doors, some hallway doors for classrooms as well as these bathrooms. And so I called a door company. And the man came down and measured for these doors, and I asked him as he was leaving, "How much are the doors going to be?" And he said, "They're going to be $600, which we were praying that God would cover everything, but $600 for doors. Unbeknownst to us, he left that day and went to the home of one of our donors. and said to her, he says, "I'm sorry I'm late. I was at this school called Cornerstone measuring for doors, and that's why I was running late." Well, she called me on the phone. She says, "That can't be a coincidence. I think I'm supposed to pay for these doors. How much are they going to be?" And I said, "They're going to be $600. Well, when that check arrived, there was $600 for the doors and $10,000 for the scholarship fund. So we knew God was going before us. So when school started, finally in August, we had the bathrooms, and we had a plumber give us the bathroom, the stools, and we had someone else doing the electrical work, and everything had been donated. And no one was using the bathrooms. They did not have stalls. And so I thought to myself, well, God, you did a pretty good job in doing these bathrooms. You must want me to just finish these off. And so I went to a bathroom place and said, I need to order bathroom stalls. And they said, well, here's what you do. You take graph paper and you measure the bathrooms and draw them to scale. And then we will order blueprints for your stalls. And then you have your installer check the blueprints, and then we place the final order. Well, I wanted to do this over Christmas break. And so I had Becky take the graph paper, go into the bathrooms and draw these to scale. And then I took the graph paper back to the bathroom place, and they said, all right, we will order blueprints. Well, the blueprints were ready the day before Thanksgiving, and I was to take them home and let my husband okay them because he was going to be our installer. And I took the blueprints home, but it was Thanksgiving, and I forgot to have Dave look at them. And so it got to be Monday after Thanksgiving, and he hadn't looked at them, and I thought, tonight, I will have him look at them tonight. But then we were busy Monday night and it didn't happen, and Tuesday I forgot, and pretty soon it's Wednesday, and I thought, tonight I will have Dave look at those blueprints so we can get these stalls ordered. Well, on that Wednesday afternoon, a truck pulls up in our parking lot and unloads bathroom stalls. I couldn't believe it. And here was the story. Eastview Christian Church was moving to their campus facility out on Airport Road, and a couple of guys from this one church went down into their one of the bathrooms and pulled out all the stalls and loaded them up on the truck. And another man who was a Cornerstone dad said, you know what, Cornerstone is praying for bathroom stalls. And so they turned the truck around and they brought the stalls to us, and we had to weld them and piece them together to make them work. But every time I did a tour at Bell Street, I would show people the bathrooms and say, look at what our great God has done.
So God continued to grow Cornerstone very rapidly. We started with 45 preschoolers. The next year we started with 88, ended with 100. We went from 88 to 162 to 235 and so on. It was amazing. As we grew, we outgrew Bell Street, and we had our upper school at Second Press, downtown Bloomington. Our preschool moved to Faith United Methodist Church. So we were in 3 different buildings and still praying together. We would gather at Bell Street as a staff and faculty. We would pray together and then scatter to 3 different campuses. Shortly thereafter, we knew that we were going to have a building. And April and I had been all over town looking at existing buildings. We came to the conclusion that an existing building, unless it was a school, was not going to work, that we were going to have to build. And so we needed land. One of our board members approached a local businessman to ask for advice. If we were to secure land, where should we be looking? What should we be looking for? How much should we expect to pay, etc. But at that meeting, this man pulled out a plat book and opened it up. And in the plat book, there were parcels of land that were highlighted in yellow. And this man said, you know, I've got a piece of property east of town, and if you're interested in it, maybe we could make a deal. And we didn't know exactly what that meant, but this piece of property was 7 miles east of Towanda Barnes Road, 4 miles further east than where we are, which seemed like the far side to us. But we never would have chosen the Bell Street location had it been up to our wisdom. And so we thought, you know, if that is the place God has for us, then it's going to be okay. So what we decided was that the 3 of us, this board member, Dan Cole, April, and I would pray and fast for 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday the following week. And so we began to pray and to fast, to ask God if that was the piece of property that He had for us. On Tuesday of that fast, unbeknownst to those of us who were praying, the man who had mentioned this land came to the owner of the property that our building now sits on, which was not for sale, and asked if he could buy it. And he did. He was able to buy it at below market prices with the intent to give it to us. And so imagine our surprise when the fast was over and we met with this man, that he told us about this property, 78 acres. At the time, he was going to give us the back 40 acres. And he said he would give it to us, but he wanted to hang on to it for a year for tax purposes. And so at the end of that year, what happened was we went to meet with him. We were getting ready for the transfer, and we walked into his office and sat down, and he said, I might be throwing a wrench into this deal. And you can imagine what we thought. My heart stopped beating. I thought, oh no, he's going to renege. But he did not. He said, how would it be if I give you the whole 78 acres instead of just the back 40? And so he gave us these beautiful 78 acres. And what happened in that year's time that he owned it, that the property appreciated from about $235,000 to $1.2 million. So now we had the collateral that we needed for this building.
So again, we began to pray that, God, you have now given us land, you must be going to give us a building. And we didn't know where that building would come from. We still had no money. We've never operated with much money. And so we were praying, and God started His good work. We went and had a rendering of the building, had a wonderful architect who gave us a beautiful design. We loved the design of the building, and so we began meeting with people and showing them what the rendering of what our building would look like. I remember we were in the office of a businessman, and I pulled out the picture and showed him, this is what our building's going to look like. We're so excited. Would you pray with us for God to do this thing? And he reached in his pocket and pulled out a check and handed it to me for $400,000. And he said, this will be towards that building. And it was amazing. God did other amazing things. I remember grandparents who committed to sending $3,000 a month until the building was built, and they did that. Other grandparents that we met with, and we took them on a Saturday morning to Bell Street to show them our current building and then the picture of what our new building was, and they said, we're going to give you $10,000. And so money started coming in like that. I also remember we had a family that Becky and I were going to meet with, and we decided we would meet at Dunkin' Donuts on Oakland Avenue. And so I love Dunkin' Donuts. I love their coffee, and we were there meeting with them, and I had my rendering, and we're sitting with this couple, except that they brought their 3-year-old daughter with them. And she proceeds to run all around Dunkin' Donuts, and I'm trying to talk about this new building and how amazing it is. And the meeting is not going well because this little girl's tearing around Dunkin' Donuts. And we get back to school, and I said to Becky, that really was not a very good meeting. And but anyway, the next week, we got a letter from this couple. And the letter said, thanks for meeting with us. We were going to build a new house, but we've decided we're going to help you build a new school instead. And so they gave us their house money, $25,000 a year. They said they would give it for 4 years. They wound up giving it for much more than 4 years. And that was what God was doing. In fact, God later blessed them with a gorgeous home of their own. But I'll never forget that meeting. But big gifts and little gifts were coming in. And yet, when we broke ground on May 28th, 2002, we did not have all the money that we needed for the building. And I'll never forget Becky getting up there at the groundbreaking and telling the world that we didn't have the money, but we trusted a great and powerful God to provide for us.
So we have so many more stories. Obviously, God built the building. We've been in it now over 10 years, 11 years. We were told when we built it that the carpet wouldn't stick because of the regulations on the adhesive, and as we sit here, we have the original carpet that still looks so great, and it is still stuck to the floor. We've learned so many lessons along the way, and just a few of them. that I think we would like to leave with you is, first of all, there's really nothing special about us, or you for that matter. God has done it all. It's what our mural in the front hallway says. And I think He wants to bless His people as He has blessed us if we would only pray and ask. Another lesson we've learned is that God cares about the little things. We have prayed for everything from overhead projectors to millions of dollars for a building, and God has heard every one of them. He obviously cares about the little things. He cares that I don't get discouraged when I order textbooks and we have no money. Here's a big one. Prayer is the only real work we do. The rest is just follow-up. If we will pray, we know that God has promised to hear and to answer in His time. Sometimes the answer is no, but it's been a remarkable journey to really walk by faith, not knowing what we need is going to come from, and to have God answer our prayers in ways that we couldn't even begin to hope for or imagine. And we've learned that God can be trusted. This school is an impossibility from a human perspective. It should not exist, and yet look at what we have. God has done it all. We can trust Him. We want His people to know that God can be trusted. And finally, when we care more about His glory than our own, we will see His glory revealed. We have known from before the beginning that this school was a place built for His glory and His glory alone. And He has shown Himself mighty on our behalf, and all glory goes to Him.
Thank you.